I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, preserving New York City's intangible heritage. I'll speak with Michael Kimmelman, architecture critic for the New York Times. We'll also hear the story of how a 25-cent banana slipped from the cart of a humble food vendor into the center of the global art world. First up, the 1000th day of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russian President Vladimir Putin lowered Russia's threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. For our next guest, it brought to mind escalation scenarios tested during the 1980s Proud Profit war game. Writing for the New York Times Magazine this week, William Langewiesche describes how a single military exercise forced the country to confront the sobering reality of nuclear warfare. Welcome to you, and thanks for joining us. That was a sobering piece in the New York Times Magazine the other day. What was the reaction to it? Was it a wake-up call, and did anybody wake up?
Of course, you never know what the individual reactions are. I mean, there's been a flood of stuff online for what that's worth, which is probably not much. Some people seem to have woken up. Other people don't pay attention at all. And the purpose of the piece was just to remind our dear readers that this problem has not gone away and did not end with the Cold War. And in fact, important lessons learned during that time are being forgotten rapidly. And it's time to readdress these problems. And the specific problem is a growing belief in an idea that was thoroughly discredited by Proud Profit in 1983. And that idea is that one can control nuclear war, and specifically one can control escalation, so that you can introduce small weapons onto a battlefield, nuclear weapons, and hope that it can be left at that. That was thoroughly disproved. That idea, that hope was abandoned for decades, but it is certainly returning now. Both the Russians and the Americans have returned to this idea, and it's an extraordinarily dangerous idea.
So as I read the article, if I read it correctly, the problem is one of escalation, that you can't just use small weapons and expect it to end there. The small weapons are going to lead to bigger weapons. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct. I mean, none of us know how nuclear war would actually unfold, or will, I would say, unfold. And there are various scenarios, none of them any good. But the one that seems to be escaping attention is this problem of escalation. In other words, we have long built, as the Russians have, our deterrent structure on retaliation, and integral to that is the idea that our biggest problem is a sneak attack, right? Bolt out of the blue. Well, it might happen. It's a pretty serious thing. So it's not that we can ignore that possibility, or should. It's not that we can ignore the current, $2 trillion modernization program to mitigate against that. We can't. We have to spend the money. But the problem is, as wise people, observers of nuclear war, know that is probably the least likely scenario of how we're going to get into a nuclear war that will end the world. And the far more likely scenario is an escalation from conventional war through the first small use of small nuclear weapons, tactical battlefield weapons, artillery, for instance, and then an escalation that gets out of control. In other words, not a sneak attack, but the opposite, basically the blossoming of an all-out nuclear war in full view. And I think many people, people I've spoken to believe that this is the most likely of the several awful scenarios, all of which have to be taken seriously, about how a nuclear war will actually unfold. It probably won't be a sneak attack. It probably will be due to our own naivete and the lessons we have forgotten from the Cold War.
If you rule out escalation, which obviously you say is not possible, what is the difference between using tactical nuclear weapons, which, as you say, they're trying to cut out civilian casualties, reduce the impact of radiation, and large conventional bombs? Why is nuclear such a toxic word?
Well, because it excites all sorts of emotions and fears of escalation. Plus, conventional bombs can't equal the destructive power of even small nuclear bombs. I mean, missile warheads. Okay, bombs is not necessarily missiles, warheads, whatever. So you very quickly move from sub-kiloton deliveries, and that's if Hiroshima was what 15 kilotons, sub-kiloton, so much smaller than Hiroshima. But you very quickly move beyond that to the need to expand the explosive power of the weapons being delivered, particularly beyond the enemy front lines to the enemy's rear, as they do the same to you. And very quickly, a threshold is crossed where it becomes a much bigger problem than, say, a 2,000-pound bomb. It also, of course, does poison the landscape.
Do we have mutually assured destruction now?
Yeah, we do have mutually assured destruction. And pretty much across the board. I mean, not just between Russia and the United States, but between China and its whatever adversaries it has. No one right now truly would dare to attack China, but the Chinese are worried about that, which is why they're expanding their arsenal. They want to make damn sure that no one would think they could pull off a sneak attack. But again, mutually assured destruction is a legitimate and effective defense against sneak attack. And it's one of the reasons, and it can be managed pretty easily. It's one of the reasons that such a sneak attack is probably not ever going to happen. But there are so many other avenues to all-out nuclear war that to say that the sneak attack is unlikely is not to rest easy.
A very sobering article in the New York Times Magazine by William Langewiesche. Coming up next, preserving the intangible heritage that makes places meaningful beyond their physical world. In an era where global uniformity threatens to erase local distinction, the preservation of culture extends far beyond safeguarding brick and mortar. The essence of a community lives in its cherished traditions, inherited wisdom, distinctive ways of life. As New York Times architecture critic Michael Kimmelman reveals, these elements are as vital to our heritage as the physical landmarks that dot our skylines. Michael wrote about this in the New York Times recently. Michael, how do we define a landmark?
It's a good question, Sam, because it's not so easy. Historically, we didn't really designate landmarks until really the 60s and 70s. We started to think more seriously about it. It mostly applies to historical architecture of some recognized significance. And the buildings have to be older. So we're talking about buildings, but that's not often what people really want to preserve.
What do they want to preserve? I mean, do they, it's funny. I remember Ed Koch used to tell me a story about he was campaigning in Coney Island once, and a woman approached him at the boardwalk, grabbed him by the lapels and said, "Mayor, make it like it was." And he said he never had the heart to tell her it never really was the way she thought it was. So what is it about nostalgia? Are we trying to preserve something that was never really there?
So that's a really good question, and Koch probably had that right. What I meant by it is that, Emery Roth was a really great architect who designed things like the San Remo and Belle Claire apartment buildings on the west side. Many of his buildings are landmarked. But if you ask a West Sider, what do they feel characterizes their neighborhood? What is it that they would like to make sure doesn't go away? They'd name something like Barney Greengrass, the Sturgeon King. And of course, Barney Greengrass, we don't have any legislation to preserve, really. It's a business. It's a family-run business. Architecturally, I mean, I sort of love it, but it's not actually anything whatsoever. It's a storefront. So what that woman was saying to Koch, of course, was, I want to preserve things that are meaningful to me in my community, in the neighborhood that I grew up with. And some of that's nostalgia, but some of it is more than that. And that's what I think gets really interesting. There are things which we would consider tent poles of our social structure, of our community. And those are the kinds of things that we often feel are fragile, especially as the economy of the city becomes more precarious for people who are not well-to-do.
And as things become more generic, where you see banks and drugstores and things like that, where everything looks the same, and big box stores all over the place.
100%. And that's obviously, therefore, one of the big issues around businesses, local businesses. In a city like San Francisco, for instance, legislation is enacted, limited but interesting, in some neighborhoods to prevent chain stores from moving in, or at least requiring businesses that have, I think it's 12 or more outlets or branches, from occupying some storefront or business there without permission, in order that local businesses can have a leg up. So they're not, so for instance, Blue Bottle, the coffee place, started in one of those neighborhoods. And because Starbucks could not just move in there, Blue Bottle was able to, this is Hayes Valley, I think, was able to sort of, establish itself. Now, Blue Bottle will be one of these businesses
Right.
that became a chain. But that was part of the point. This is meaningful to the neighborhood. We want our local identity. And you see along Broadway, the decimation of so many blocks, which you have empty storefronts, and much of that is, the real estate owners waiting for a bank or somebody else is going to pay maximum rent. And in the meantime, the neighborhood suffers. People don't want that. You
wrote in that article that New York has a historic business preservation registry. Does that have the same effect?
So far it's pretty toothless. This sort of subject has come up. I kind of use the phrase intangible heritage in the article I wrote, which is a phrase that often means something else, really. It's used by UNESCO and others to designate everything from the French culinary tradition to the process by which the Japanese rebuild one of their ancient shrines, the craft of carpentry, these things which are not like just the most distinguished work of architecture. And we don't really have that here. And one of the reasons, I think, is because we are such a sort of capitalist society. So we want not to privilege one business, say, over another and make it difficult to compete. And that's been one of New York's virtues and one of its problems, too. So we've done other things. We will have districts designated, but they, again, haven't really done much to actually preserve those neighborhoods. The registry, Sahadi, the Middle Eastern grocer on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, is on that registry. I think they get a plaque or something. I mean, it's complicated, right?
Sure, because do you provide a subsidy? Do you provide a tax benefit? And how do you keep someone in business if they need to go out of business or they can't afford to stay in business?
Correct. Then you have a public subsidy for a business that also is an advantage over other potentially better, or in any case, competing businesses. That's exactly right. In San Francisco, what they will do, though, is also provide legacy businesses, the equivalent of something like Barney Greengrass, something that's been around for a long time, with some specific ownership, some small financial help for a period of time if the problem is they're not quite able to meet the rent. But if they're really just sort of going out of business, I don't think they're eligible. And in any case, even San Francisco doesn't do that. But it's not only businesses. It could be something like a farmer's market. A farmer's market can come into a schoolyard. What the neighborhood wants to preserve is not necessarily the schoolyard, but the schoolyard is the void, which is filled by the farmer's market. That may be something that distinguishes a neighborhood.
And as you wrote in the article, you cited the case of the Stonewall Inn,
Right.
which is landmarked in a sense, but it could also become a bagel shop or something else. It's not landmarked as the Stonewall Inn per se.
That's right, because the landmark legislation doesn't require use. In fact, it doesn't say anything about use. When it was originally established, the phrasing of the legislation did talk about preserving cultural, social issues, but it sort of evolved very quickly into specifically architectural issues. I mean, there's fudging, of course, but Stonewall's a really good example. That occupies two old, I think, horse stables, not very distinguished buildings in the village on Christopher Street. And, the Stonewall itself, the bar was kind of a dump, owned by the Genovese crime family. It closed shortly after the uprising. And when it was designated as a landmark, what was designated is the building with a plaque on it, which means that the owners of it now, they can't change the flower boxes or swap out the windows without getting permission from city planning. But it says nothing about use. So the place, which is a bar, not the same one, of course, but a bar, it could become a dentist's office or a bagel shop. We don't say anything about that.
That's interesting. This is approached to some extent in a new book by Barbara Diamonstein Spielvogel celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Landmarks Law. Has that law been effective, or, as you suggest in the article, has landmarking been sort of weaponized as a NIMBY tool?
Both. Certainly, the landmarks legislation, it's almost arguable, and maybe it is correct to say that almost no piece of legislation has had as big an effect on the city and more widely landmarks legislation on the country than this particular area of landmarking, because it allowed cities, communities to begin to designate areas and to think about preserving things in ways that they just weren't able to do before. So all sorts of places have been preserved, and thank God for that. But it is absolutely true that increasingly, and this, by the way, is also true of environmental legislation, that as the economy has changed and society has changed, a lot of this legislation, which was enacted to protect things that were threatened, have been used to prevent things that are needed. To flip to the environmental legislation that was originally enacted to prevent a cement plant from polluting the Hudson River is now being used to prevent solar farms and wind farms or low-income housing from being built, which was not really envisioned back when this was passed. And that is the case with landmark legislation too. It's a mixed bag, is the transcript.
So how do we reconcile those two things?
Yeah.
We're dealing with that in terms of so-called affordable housing, density versus the need for housing. Is there any right way to do that?
You could say that the messiness of democracy is being carried out in our discussions around these sort of issues, that the sort of legislative volumes that have been accumulated over the decades to make it increasingly difficult to get things done are partly what you saw result in the last election. And this sort of pendulum swing, which is now interestingly uniting both some people on the right who don't want legislation, billionaires, let's say, and other people on the left who want more affordable housing and more density and so forth. Essentially, they share on some level an agreement that the legislative obstacles have become too numerous and we have to pare them down. Now, how you do that, who would pare what, that's where the politics separate. But I find it interesting that this is kind of flipping back.
That's the whole rub about benevolent despotism. How do you keep the despot benevolent? Michael Kimmelman of the New York Times, thanks so much for joining us. I'll be right back to talk about how modern art has gone completely bananas. You may have already heard about the duct tape banana that's been sweeping the art world. Maurizio Cattelan's Comedian first debuted at Art Basel in Miami in 2019. Just last month, it sold for over $6 million. New York Times writer Sarah Maslin Nir recently followed the once humble banana from a fruit vendor outside of Sotheby's to become one of the most discussed artworks of our time. A great story, a great initiative on her part in finding this story. Now, when is a banana just a banana?
Well, apparently never, because any banana can be taped to a wall and become a piece of absurdist art, according to Maurizio Cattelan. Comedian was designed as a send-up of the art world to kind of poke fun at its absurdities, and I think it did just that.
Comedian, who got the last laugh in this? $6.2 million? That's incredible.
Well, Sotheby's announced this artwork would be sold at auction, and it ended up sold to a crypto billionaire named Justin Sun from China, a bidding war among several crypto billionaires and millionaires. And in their announcement, they said the banana was purchased that morning just outside of Sotheby's on York Avenue. And I thought, who did they buy it from? So
Good question. And nobody else asked that.
Thanks, Sam. So I walked myself to 72nd and York Avenue, and lo and behold, right outside the front doors of this gleaming auction house was a humble fruit stand. And I found the seller. He's a Bengali gentleman by the name of Shah Alam, and he sold that banana for 25 cents.
25 cents, really. And I hope he's raised the price since then.
Well, when I told Mr. Alam about this, he actually began to cry. He felt that the joke of Comedian was at his expense. He is a man who lives in a basement apartment with 5 other men. He pays $500 a month for that grim living condition. He makes $12 an hour for his 12-hour-a-day shift. And he felt that this story that went viral about the $6 million banana, he was lost in that story, and people like him as well.
He said he doesn't make any profit on selling bananas either.
Yes, so he doesn't own the fruit stand. I spoke to the owner, and the owner said that there's very little profit margin in a banana. Other fruits like persimmon or pomegranate make you money, but a banana is something you need to have customers, but you don't make a ton.
And people have offered him money as a result of the story, yes?
Subsequent to the story coming out, readers became really enraged about the situation, about the sort of burning of $6 million, right, on a banana that actually the crypto billionaire ate it live as to be part of the artwork, he said on X. And they were incensed, and readers raised about $30,000 for him, independent of the New York Times. Mr. Sun announced that he would buy 100,000 bananas from that stand, but as we just discussed, that really doesn't earn the stand more than $6,000, and it's a lot of work. Subsequently, yesterday, I'm happy to announce that Mr. Sun gave $50,000 directly to Mr. Shah Alam.
As a result of the story, I hope. Mm-hmm. Good for you and good for him and good for the New York Times. Now, what happened to the artwork if he ate the banana?
The artwork comes with an instruction manual that you are allowed to replace the banana as needed. I think you can eat it as needed, too.
And what about the duct tape?
We have to ask Maurizio.
Uh-huh. Now, what was he trying to prove? I mean, was this just a, as you say, a total send-up of how crazy the art world is?
I think that art can be many things to many people. Marcel Duchamp put a urinal in an art museum and called it a fountain. You know, there is no shortage of artists poking fun at what art means. I think you can find meaning in any of it. But what really interested me about this story, Sam, was who wasn't finding meaning and who was rendered meaningless by this story, and that was the Bengali fruit vendor who was a part of the story everyone had overlooked.
And what about the guy who spent $6.2 million? Now, obviously, he had a lot more than that, and this was disposable income for him. But how did he feel about spending that much money even if it wasn't that much money for him, when you could have spent that much money on all sorts of other things that would have been much more constructive.
Sure. I mean, that's the time immemorial question about wealth and wealth disparity. Mr. Sun is very proud of purchasing what he thinks is a historic piece of art and being part of this piece of art story. Actually, there are some investigations that came out yesterday that he's under investigation from the SEC, that he has some other troubles. He may have inadvertently or perhaps intentionally contributed to Donald Trump's crypto campaigns. It's a complicated mess of a story. It's still unfolding. So Justin Sun is a person to watch far beyond the banana.
I'd like to think that other than his contribution to Mr. Sun, that those stories will continue, because it just sounds, I don't know, appalling, outrageous. What other adjective would you apply to it? I'm going to stop there, I think. You also covered the Thanksgiving Day parade from behind the scenes. What happened in that surprised you?
Sure, I cover it every year.
I know.
Sam.
This was what, the 10th or
12th.
12th, okay. And you said the most interesting thing about covering the parade is the people.
Oh, of course. There is no parade without the people. And everyone else is looking up at the balloons. And I spend my whole time at the parade looking into the crowd, looking for stories there, stories on people's faces. It was a wet, epically wet day. People had camped out since 2 in the morning.
Doesn't matter what the weather is.
Not in the slightest. There were people who had done it for 40 years, rain, sleet, snow. The parade's only been canceled twice, so the balloons and the show goes on. And hopefully I'll keep going on and covering that for many more years to come.
I hope so. I took my granddaughters a couple of years ago and almost froze to death. They didn't seem to mind in the least. And tell me one last thing about a squirrel and why its death became so political.
Sure. I talked about this with Jeff Mays on your show the other week. This squirrel is the squirrel heard around the world. His name was Peanut. He was an Instagram famous squirrel, and unfortunately wildlife authorities came in and confiscated him because the owner did not have the proper paperwork, and he bit someone and was euthanized. This squirrel, for some reason, because it's 2024, became a political lightning rod of government overreach and was spoken about on the campaign trail by J.D. Vance, by Marjorie Taylor Greene, and what is most amusing to me about this story is the squirrel's owner has never voted, and he is apolitical. He just loved his squirrel.
Love the squirrel. And you really need the proper paperwork to have a squirrel.
Yes, Sam, get your paperwork in order or your squirrel will be confiscated.
I know. I don't want to say that's nuts, but okay. Sarah Maslin Nir of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. That's it for this edition of the New York Times Close Up. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our program weekly on the go, anytime, anywhere.